Thanks so much again for coming to our panel. We're going to be talking about animal feed and animal production. It's a really interesting topic that I think all of us here are really passionate about. So we're going to start by just introducing our panel, and I'll give everybody a chance to kind of say what they do and who they work for.
I'm Caleb, the CEO of Renaissance Ag. We focus on being a foundational partner of production for livestock producers, and we make vertical farming equipment. We also guide on inclusion rates and the science in animal husbandry to achieve the desired outcomes you're looking for in livestock production. And our focus is on domestic production capacity and bringing that entire production cycle in country.
Is it really a benefit to increase domestic animal production if you have that reliance on animal feed, importing animal feed? And where do we really see reducing the imports of animal feed and animal products? I think it's close to $5 billion USD is spent on importing animal products and meat-related products in the UAE. So GCC, how do we then use indoor agriculture, other agtech solutions to localize animal feed and really remove that dependency? Caleb, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think that in order to have a domestic supply and a real domestic production of livestock, we do need to create a path for domestic production of livestock feed. And as my colleague mentioned, there's a couple of things that impact animal health and animal welfare. One is genetics. The other is the quality of the feed that you're feeding to those animals and the quality of the water that you're providing, so quality of inputs. And then finally, there's also the total environmental condition or context of that animal. Is the animal husbandry proper? Is their environment right? Do they have enough shade, enough bedding, and movement opportunities? Those types of things. And as we look at creating a domestic production of those inputs, so the water and the feed, I think we need to do it in a way that solves the traditional problem with domestic production, which is quality versus domestic production. Right now we're importing 90% of livestock feed for meat and milk in the GCC, and we don't want to lose the quality of those imports when we move to domestic production. We also need to solve two other problems. Number one is, if we're going to move to domestic production, we shouldn't do it as a side project. It shouldn't be something that solves part of the problem. It needs to solve for the entirety of the problem. So we should move away from 90% importing to 80%. That's not that valuable. But if we can go from 90% importing feed to 10% or less, it becomes extremely valuable domestically. In addition, we need to do this in a way that improves the economic value of the livestock product. So we're thinking about meat, milk, and eggs. That value needs to increase. Otherwise, these initiatives will peter out over time. They'll tend to disappear. Alex, you were talking about government regulation and what can the government do. There's a piece of this that does require government regulation. Governments need to open the door to these novel agtech products coming into the GCC so that we can produce this domestic livestock feed. Additionally, we need to create revenue paths or financial paths that can fund the purchase or the creation of those products so that all the livestock producers can participate. And as we look at this from a domestic perspective, livestock feed is fairly complex. It's not as simple as let's create a farm and now we'll have livestock feed.
Trying to get a total mixed ration.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot going into that.
There's dry matter products, there's macro nutrients, there's micronutrients. And what we found is that to pull this off domestically, we need to have a collaboration between multiple systems. We need to have traditional farming producing some of these initial inputs like seed or hay or other premium forages. And then we need to partner with agtech to produce vertical farms that take that seed and express it as a sprout that improves vitamin levels, phytonutrients, enzymatic behavior, so that the animal performs better. It has better nutrition, more efficiency in its diet. That diet is more valuable to the animal because we have active enzymes that improves total digestion of other, maybe less premium feed products like straw or less premium hay. At the same time, we need to increase, as I said, the vitamins that improve the animal health and performance. And if we do this in the right way, those improvements for the animal translate to improvements for the human that's consuming those animal products. So now we're looking at meat, milk, and eggs that have higher levels of phytonutrients, higher levels of vitamins, better fatty acids, and that translates into health for the human that consumes them domestically. This improves the domestic product and the value of that product so that now we can economically compete with imports. And so that we don't have this problem of, oh, we were looking at Italian leather from Italy. It's like, no, we actually now have a better domestic product internally within the GCC and within each country in the GCC that outperforms the imported products. And then finally, we need to take, I think, the outputs from those animals. So there's waste like manure and feces. Then when you process the animal, you get the offals and the intestines, the skin, the blood. And there's an opportunity through vertical farming to take those outputs, process them, and turn them into domestic fertilizer production and domestic protein production. Because as we're talking about a TMR, you need protein domestically to be generated for livestock feed. You need fresh forages and premium forages. You also need fertilizer to produce those. So if we stop importing the hay and grains and micronutrients, but we keep importing the fertilizers and we keep importing the proteins, we're in the same situation. So when you think about this as a complex system, leverage the relationship between traditional land-based agriculture, new novel agri-tech and vertical farming in partnership to now create domestic protein production, domestic fertilizer production, domestic grain and premium forage production, and do it in a way that's efficient with water usage. So now we're thinking about how do I reduce my initial water inputs, how do I reuse those inputs to continually produce this regenerative cycle where now I'm growing the grain and the forage domestically, consuming it domestically, processing it domestically, and creating new inputs domestically. So I think there's a lot of promise, but it does need government assistance and the regulation to open the doors, and then it needs to take into account the actual animal science.
Agreed.
Absolutely. And building off your first point, Caleb, I think you really touched it on the opening of the market to look at it more than just a product a change to the system as it currently sits, right?
Yeah.
And so, Majid, maybe you could touch on how you think we can attract the real attention and win the attention of private, public sectors to really focus on animal health, animal feed, and make that a reality here.
So a challenge is when you have both those parties working in silo, and a lot of the time you will have all the private sector coming together, generating ideas, but in the isolation of government. Governments are trying to set up policy, legislation, regulation to help facilitate or monitor and regulate certain aspects of this industry. But if it's in a vacuum from the private sector and it's not being informed by the needs, that's where you have the real challenge, right? Especially with as much innovative technology or sort of solutions that are coming to our region. Government has to be not only the best informed, but really be ahead of the curve to work with these companies to facilitate business for them. In the sense that, yes, here's a license, here's what you can do, this is a different way. Typically, what we see as a consultancy are a lot of companies that come to us and say, I just don't know where to put my first foot down. And that challenge means there's friction on the setup and friction on the solution providing to begin with in the market. Where governments, within their ability is how do we get them to learn about all these technologies that are coming in. This is a good place as any, and we've seen some of the government already here, so I'm very happy with that. But the reverse there is that the private sector needs to hear what the government is trying to do and address those challenges, as opposed to only the perceived challenges. When you're a hammer, everything is a nail kind of thing. So we can solve. Well, actually, no. Solve what we really need solving. And we've talked about that as it's importing feed and growing a feed industry isn't going to be the solution. We need to unlock potential here in the market, in our own economy, to say, okay, there's plenty of opportunities to either, create sustainable source of feed through controlled environment, be able to create a TMR with other sources of protein and micronutrients, and create that collaboratively. What we as a consultancy always try to do is have both parties convene, stakeholders from both parties, sit in more close, intimate conversations, understand maybe where a challenge needs both parties' input, and also a sharing of the risk. And we've seen that, PPPs are nice ideas, but if the division of risk and reward isn't optimal for both parties, it's always going to be lopsided and really not deliver for one party. So here, what we're trying to do is, with technologies such as colleagues here on the panel, as well as government initiatives that sometimes are being announced, what SOMA is trying to do is have everybody find them in one place. So ultimately, all the companies inbound, as well as the players in the market, know if they're trying to catch up with these very fast-moving regulation and policy, there's a one-stop shop rather than everybody sifting through social media and trying to find, okay, why is this relevant? How does this affect us? To be able to get this information exchange to speed up. I still think there's still way more potential to be unlocked in this region. I believe the UAE is demonstrating really a first mover in this space to be able to get tech to work with government and really implement here. But I think the market is a lot broader, GCC and wider, and hopefully with everybody meeting here today, we're creating this nucleus of momentum that can roll out into the region on the back of what is already very well established logistics and business practices between the countries.
Absolutely. And I think we've talked as a group a lot about what the large picture looks like, what needs to happen holistically, economically, to make it possible to reduce dependency for food imports, for feed imports. But also, I think you make a great point about including a diversity of stakeholders and listening to them. And that also comes down to the farmer, right?
Yeah,
and listening to the farmer and what they have to say and what challenges they're experiencing. How do we solve for those challenges? So Alex, maybe you can touch a little bit, talking a little bit about the vertical farming space. That's more your area of speciality. And what do you think the economic benefits are for the farmer and looking at this type of technology and integrating a feed technology for animal production?
Well, it's a very tricky question because obviously there is no right or wrong. There is no business case or no business case. I mean, it's at the end producing what we're producing, which is hydroponic fodder. Its competitiveness will depend on the procurement of your customer. So if you're dealing with a big customer that is procuring for $50 million a year or $100 million a year of alfalfa, hay, and so on, obviously they're going to get a strong bargain negotiation. They're going to get very attractive prices of alfalfa and others, and then the economics of your solution might be very different than if you would sell it to a little farmer that have 500 heads and that is buying at a much higher price. So I would say the first point in terms of assessing the economics, the true economics and the viability of this is your market. Are you looking at players that are procuring aggressively or less aggressively? The second point is what part of the TMR, the total mix ratio, you're replacing, and what is the sweet spot? Because we all think that selling fodder to meat and dairy players, you just replace a product A by a product B, but it's absolutely wrong. And at the end, you need to find exactly the sweet spot of replacement to reach an optimal output either on the milk productivity or on the meat gain. And that calculation is actually, I think, the challenging question. There is no right or wrong. It's just a matter of case by case. You need to understand very well what your customer wants, do the exact study, and based on that, you'll understand if there's a business sense for what you can produce and deliver. This is when we talk about the upfront part, but then you have the intangible or the consequences of your product, which could be, for example, the health benefits, or it could be the increase of productivity that your product, that the hydroponic fodder can provide to the cattle, to the animals you're feeding. and these could have indirect economical benefits to the equation that needs to be added on top to understand the total benefit, to have a holistic view on the whole benefit. So we're always confronted to this question: is it economically viable? My answer is really let's sit together. If there is enough scale, and I need to understand what you're currently spending, but then based on that, I can tell you if it's economically viable or not. I guess I can share the same. I can share the mic with my colleague Caleb. I'm sure he will echo some of what I'm saying.
I don't know. I think you covered it really well.
Yeah.
But I do think there's two parts of this that are very important, and that both of my colleagues discussed. One is these initiatives have to be done in collaboration with the government, but also in collaboration with the consumer. Mm-hmm. And the initial consumer is the livestock producer. This can't be us coming in and saying, we know better, this is how you should do it. The real relationship needs to be understanding that the livestock producer knows how to produce their livestock. They know animal husbandry. We're not trying to reinvent their wheel and move them into the future. I think that's a bit of a misnomer in agtech. We're not creating the future. What we really should be doing is looking to the past and saying, how do we support the production? And how do we support the producer? And so part of that means our innovations cannot give more labor and more work to the producer. We need to take labor and take work from the producer and be more efficient while producing a premium feed for their livestock. The second thing we need to do is bring the final consumer into the equation. So we have the government, we've got the producer, and now we need the consumer of those producers' goods to be brought into the equation, and awareness delivered to the consumer about the value of this type of animal practice, this type of livestock feed inputs, what it means for them from a nutritional perspective, and then clarity on whether they're getting that or not. And then allow the consumer to have demand for that product and pull that product through the system. So now they're telling their government, hey, we want these products. How do you support us getting them? They're telling the producer, we want you to practice good animal husbandry and to feed these premium products to the animal domestically so that we can then consume it. So I think there's a collaboration between those three parties that needs to take place.
Absolutely. Majid, did you have anything else you want to add?
It almost gets to the point, and I appreciate that we've now made it so inclusive. Like, that holistic perspective is always needed, but there's no one actor that's going to make the difference, and therein lies the challenge. Is you need everybody to sort of come around and champion the cause, where the government creates awareness as well as the end producer, really speaking to the customer to say this is important, and then the customers with their awareness demanding that. You create that economic drive to say this is the way forward. But if there's one voice sort of standing on that soapbox, that this is important, we got to do it, it's one hand clapping. You're not going to have the impact you need, and it just won't. You'll burn out as a producer or as a technology provider. So there is this thing about bringing everybody together and creating that rising tide for everybody. As Caleb was saying about getting that quality in the ecosystem. I appreciate he's thinking well past just the meat. There's all the other outputs of meat production where you have hides, offals, the blood, and there are so many sort of examples abroad where we have these outputs from animal systems that go into things like the medical industry, biomedical industry. There are inputs that they need, when you're producing agar plates for bacteriology, the blood agar needs to be sourced somewhere. So creating more efficiency, finding more outputs or ways for those outputs to go, and really having everybody sort of arm in arm around that and champion it. And ultimately, as more of us are speaking together on the matter as opposed to our own voice, we should be able to get that critical mass.
And not to add another layer of complexity, but we also have the environmental component, right? And that's a huge piece that's often talked about, and one of the reasons it's such a challenge right now for agricultural production. So, Caleb, can you talk a little bit about what can be done in order to support local livestock production in this region while conserving a key natural resource of water?
So I think there's a really big target on livestock production and agriculture in general from an environmental perspective. We hear about this all the time, the carbon footprint of ag production, the water intake and requirement of ag production. For example, in California, the #1 consumer of water is the alfalfa crop. So alfalfa in California consumes more water, and then it's shipped all around the world, and it consumes more water than everyone else, any other individual consumer. And so as we think about livestock production as a domestic need inside the Gulf Coast countries, we then think about, okay, we need to produce livestock feed domestically. And then you see these stories about #1 consumer of water in California is the alfalfa crop. That's true in Arizona and Utah and other places. It's true in Europe. It's true in the Gulf Coast countries. The #1 crop that consumes water is forage for these animals. So we have this complex relationship between we need to bring this production in-house and make it domestic. At the same time, we need to reduce the water input required to do that. And so there's a balance that has to come about. There's no magic solution. Vertical farming and ag tech is part of the answer, but it is not the entirety of the answer. And I think we need to be aware of that.
There's no silver bullet. It's not a panacea.
That's right, and it would be really great if there was. And but maybe it's actually better that there's not, because in one person I control too much. And so in this way, the answer is more diversified. So I think there's a couple of things that need to happen. #1, we need to think about where and how do we reduce the initial water inputs for agriculture. #2, how do we then reuse those inputs? Where and how can we reuse them? Because ag is in competition inherently in the Gulf Coast countries with luxury swimming pools at high-end hotels, with high-end restaurants and washing your clothes at the high-end establishments. It's in production with window cleaning on skyscrapers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that can outperform the economic power of ag in competition for water. So we need to think about how do we reduce the water, how do we reuse the water? And there's several things we can do. I think when it comes to livestock production, there's a real magical place where the water reuse and the initial water usage and the water reusage, I'm using that word too many times, comes into play. For example, I can use gray water potentially to raise the crops that are then fed to the livestock. I can use that leftover water from the gray water to then be a part of the vertical farming for livestock production. So if I raise my initial crop on land using gray water, I can then take that crop, sprout it in a vertical application, enhance the value of that crop to the livestock, and use that gray water to do the sprouting as well, and then recycle the water in that system. So now if I'm using 99% less water, which is what a microgreen fodder offers, 99% less water to produce that as a forage for your animal than regular traditional alfalfa production, for example, I've reduced my input. But then vertical farming gives me the opportunity to recycle that water and reuse it again and again. So now I've reduced my waste, and so I'm more efficient in my process. The next thing we can think about is how do I reduce the overall burden domestically for alfalfa or hay or forage production from the beginning. So as we look at more efficient feed systems, how do we produce a feed that's more efficient for the animal that reduces dry matter intake or reduces the amount of alfalfa I need to feed that animal? We now get a second layer of winning. Microgreens and fodder in particular has this opportunity because of the active enzyme element at play inside the fodder. So when you sprout a seed, enzymes become active. Those active enzymes in a ruminant animal help that ruminant animal digest other feed more efficiently. So now I have to feed it less. Maybe I have to feed it 10% less dry matter. That means upstream I have 10% less alfalfa I have to produce in order to get the same output from the animal. Additionally, these microgreens can improve the components of the meat, milk, and eggs. So milk components are improved, fatty acids are improved, and so now I get a better quality product. Not just the same amount or a little bit more, but it's also better in quality. Overall, that reduces my need for initial water inputs in relationship to the quality and the volume of the feed I'm producing, or the livestock products that I'm producing. So I think there's that interplay between the two that are very important. So we need to think about how do we reduce initial consumption, how do we reuse the water as we move forward. This gives us an economic opportunity to outcompete the skyscrapers and the resorts and the luxury swimming pools and the car washes, because we're using secondary water, we're reusing that water again and again, and we're reducing the overall demand for it.
I was doing a talk yesterday on sustainable supply chain, and literally this is creating that circularity in the feed system, if you will, is going to be critical, especially in this part of the world, because water is top most critical resource, simply because, well, it is so limited, and ultimately with such little rainfall, we want to make sure we keep it in, drop for drop, all the value within the system before it departs one way or another. And along with that, there's the challenge of stigma around, having that treated water that's recaptured. Some people get a little sensitive when they think about where it might be coming from. So again, awareness on top of that needs to be in play so that people understand that we're winning by doing this, and it's not, it's as clean as it can be and needs to be, so people can see it in their fodder that's fed to animals. There's many ways of having it one step removed before it's going into our food, but absolutely, I'm with you on that, just to find value in all of these streams and bring them back to the system.
Yeah. And just one more point, and then I'll give it back to you, Alex. But Alex made a good point earlier about government regulation.
Yeah.
When it comes to great water, we need that government regulation to open the door for the reuse of water as well.
Yeah, just to add a little comment on all of that. So I come from the water sector as well, since I've been involved on multiple desalination plants here in the region. And probably many of you knows it, but GCC is the highest consumer of desalinated water in the world. The largest desalinated plants are in Saudi, are in UAE, and I think, unfortunately or fortunately, it's maybe because we managed to build extremely competitive desalination plants that were maybe less sensitive about the cost of water, and maybe that's one of the reasons why you mentioned skyscraper, luxury swimming pool, and so on. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's consumed without maybe the same attention as what we would see in some other parts of the world where water is more scarce. But although if the governments of UAE and Saudi are banning agriculture of water-intensive crops, it's because they know that they cannot use water desalination for conventional agriculture, and the water that is under the ground, which is non-renewable, that has been here for millions of years, it will not come back again. So there is no way to spoil it in temporary agriculture or maybe miscalculated agriculture. So I fully echo the approach of reusing the water. I think this is the smartest approach that we can do. Today there are so many well-matured technology that can allow us to do so. And I think the whole beauty of hydroponic fodder is hydroponic. It's the fact that we reuse water, we optimize the cycle of the water, we decrease the evaporation rate, and there are multiple other areas to look at when it comes to saving water. So just wanted to add those layers to the discussion.
Absolutely. It's all about the local context and how all of these different layers really create a very complex picture around animal feed and animal production just more generally. So thank you all for sharing those really valuable insights. That concludes our panel for today. So thank you to Majid and Caleb and Alex for being here. Really appreciate it. And we'll be moving on to our next talk very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.